The champagne glass slipped from my hand, shattering across the polished marble floor of the Mountain View Country Club as my sister Victoria held up my gift to our father, a simple handmade photo album, and announced to the 100 guests assembled that this was exactly why I'd never amount to anything. While everyone laughed at her joke about my teacher's salary, they had no idea that tucked in my purse was a set of keys to the lakefront property at Cedar Point, the place where Dad had dreamed of retiring since I was 5 years old. The place Victoria had just told everyone was way beyond our family's reach. The place I'd been secretly paying for over the last 18 months, thanks to Grandpa Henry's final gift that nobody except his attorney knew existed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Richardson, and for 32 years I've lived in the shadow of my older sister's accomplishments. Victoria graduated top of her class from Duke Law School while I went to the State University on a teaching scholarship. She made partner at Morrison and Associates before turning 35 while I celebrated getting tenure at Riverside Elementary. She drives a Mercedes and lives in a 5,000 square foot house in Prestigious Meadows while I rent a 2-bedroom apartment close enough to school that I can walk on nice days. But none of that ever bothered me because I loved my work, loved my students, and believed that success wasn't measured solely in dollar signs. At least, I believed my family understood that too, until the night of Dad's retirement party proved otherwise. Dad, Robert Richardson, had spent 35 years with the Asheville Fire Department, working his way up from rookie firefighter to captain of Station 12. He'd saved lives, mentored young firefighters, and become a fixture in our community. His retirement party should have been a celebration of service and dedication, but Victoria had insisted on hosting it at the country club where she was a member, turning what Dad wanted as a simple backyard barbecue into a formal affair with catering and a string quartet. Mom had sided with Victoria, as she always did, saying that Dad deserved something elegant, something that reflected well on the family. What she really meant was something that reflected well on Victoria's status. I'd arrived early that evening, parking my 10-year-old Honda between rows of luxury vehicles and feeling immediately out of place. Inside, Victoria had transformed the banquet hall into something that belonged in a magazine spread, with ice sculptures and elaborate floral arrangements that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She stood near the entrance in a designer dress that cost what I made in 2 months, greeting guests with the kind of confident smile that came from never doubting your place in the world. "Emma," she'd said when she saw me, her eyes scanning my department store dress with barely concealed disappointment. "You made it. I wasn't sure you'd come after all." "Of course I came," I'd replied, holding the carefully wrapped photo album against my chest. "It's Dad's party." "Yes, well," she gestured vaguely at the room. "I hope you're comfortable. I know this isn't exactly your usual scene." She'd moved on before I could respond, leaving me standing there with the familiar feeling of being tolerated rather than welcomed. The album had taken me 3 months to create. I'd gone through decades of family photos, carefully selecting images that told the story of Dad's life and career. Pictures of him as a young firefighter, grinning in front of the engine. Photos of him teaching me to fish at Cedar Point Lake during our summer vacations. Images of him at both our graduations, pride evident in his face whether he was celebrating Victoria's law degree or my teaching certificate. I'd written captions for each photo, little memories and inside jokes that only Dad would fully appreciate. It wasn't expensive, but it was personal, filled with love and attention that money couldn't buy. The party progressed with speeches from Dad's colleagues, funny stories about calls they'd responded to together, and genuine warmth from people whose lives he'd touched. Dad looked happy but slightly uncomfortable in the tuxedo Victoria had insisted he rent, his weathered firefighter's hands fidgeting with his bow tie. He kept glancing around the room as if searching for something more authentic, more real than the polished perfection Victoria had orchestrated. When it came time for gifts, Victoria had arranged a formal presentation area near the head table. She went first, naturally, unveiling her gift with the kind of flourish that drew every eye in the room. It was an all-expenses-paid cruise to Alaska, 2 weeks of luxury travel with excursions and fine dining. The crowd applauded appreciatively as she described the itinerary she'd personally selected, the premium cabin she'd booked, and the exclusive shore experiences she'd arranged. Dad thanked her warmly, hugging her while cameras flashed, but I noticed something in his eyes, a flicker of something that might have been disappointment, though he hid it quickly. Other gifts followed, each one announced and displayed. Uncle Frank gave a high-end fishing rod setup. Mom's sister contributed a leather recliner with massage features. Family friends offered gift cards to expensive restaurants and tickets to sporting events. Everything was nice, appropriate, exactly what you'd expect at a retirement party for someone who'd given 35 years to public service. Then Victoria called my name, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was about to make me the punchline of a joke. "Emma, why don't you show everyone what you brought?" I'd walked to the front, feeling the weight of 100 gazes on my simple dress and modestly wrapped gift. Dad's face lit up when he saw me, genuine pleasure in his expression that gave me courage. I'd handed him the album, watching as he carefully removed the wrapping paper. Before he could open it, Victoria had leaned over his shoulder, her perfectly manicured hand flipping through the first few pages. "Oh, Emma," she'd said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "A scrapbook. How very you. I'm sure Dad will treasure this almost as much as, say, an actual vacation. Or a new truck. Or anything that didn't come from a craft store." Laughter rippled through the crowd, polite but present. Mom had smiled indulgently as if Victoria was just being playfully honest. Dad had started to say something, but Victoria was already holding up the album for everyone to see. "This is exactly what I'm always telling people about my little sister," she'd continued, her voice dripping with condescension disguised as affection. "She has such a big heart, but let's be honest, on a teacher's salary, we can't expect much more than heartfelt craft projects. I mean, it's sweet, really. Very elementary school art class. I'm sure your students love this kind of thing, Em." The room had gone quiet, that particular silence that comes when people don't know whether to laugh or look away. I'd felt heat rising in my cheeks, humiliation burning through me as Victoria continued her performance. "You know what Dad was just telling me last week?" she'd said, turning to address the crowd like she was giving a presentation in court. "He was talking about that beautiful lakefront cabin at Cedar Point, the one he's driven past every summer since we were kids. Remember that place, Emma? Where we used to vacation in that tiny rental cottage? Well, Dad mentioned how amazing it would be to retire there, right on the water. Of course, properties like that go for over $1 million now." She'd laughed, a bright, cutting sound. "So we can dream, but some things are just beyond reach for families like ours. Unlike this adorable little scrapbook, which I'm sure cost, what, maybe $50. Supplies and all." That's when the champagne glass had slipped from my hand. Not because of her cruelty, which I was used to. Not because of the laughter, which I'd learned to endure. But because in my purse, sitting not 10 feet away at my assigned table in the back of the room, was a deed with my father's name on it, signed and notarized. The lakefront cabin at Cedar Point, all 4 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms of it, sitting on 2 acres of prime waterfront property. The place Victoria had just declared beyond our reach. The place I'd purchased 18 months ago using the inheritance from Grandpa Henry that nobody in my family except Howard Blake, his attorney, knew I'd received. Grandpa Henry had been different from the rest of my family. While Mom pushed Victoria toward prestigious careers and material success, Grandpa had valued character over credentials. He'd been a quiet man who'd made his money through careful investments and frugal living, never flashing his wealth, never seeking recognition. He'd sold his small chain of hardware stores when I was in college and lived simply in his modest home, driving the same truck for 15 years, shopping at discount stores, and giving generously to causes nobody knew about. Victoria had found him boring and old-fashioned, visiting only on obligatory holidays. I'd spent hours with him every week, listening to his stories, learning about his investment philosophy, and absorbing his belief that true wealth was measured in relationships and peace of mind, not possessions and status. When he passed 3 years ago, there'd been a standard funeral and a simple will reading. He'd left token amounts to various family members, including $20,000 each to Victoria and me. Victoria had spent hers on a kitchen renovation. I'd invested mine on Grandpa's advice given years earlier, putting it into index funds and letting it grow. What nobody knew was that 2 weeks after the public will reading, Howard Blake had called me to his office for a private meeting. The law office of Blake and Associates occupied a brick building in downtown Asheville that had stood since the 1920s. Howard Blake himself was in his mid-70s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a manner that put people at ease. He'd been Grandpa Henry's attorney for over 40 years, handling everything from business contracts to estate planning. When I'd arrived at his office that afternoon, still wearing the black dress from the funeral, I'd expected maybe some personal items Grandpa had wanted me to have, perhaps his old pocket watch or a collection of books. Instead, Howard had closed the door to his private office and pulled out a folder thick with documents. "Miss Richardson," he begun, "your grandfather left specific instructions that I was to meet with you privately, separate from the family will reading. What I'm about to share with you was his wish, carefully planned over the last decade of his life." He'd opened the folder and slid a statement across the desk. I'd stared at the number, unable to process what I was seeing. $2.4 million in a trust with my name on it. "I don't understand," I'd whispered. "This can't be right." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "It's quite right," Howard had assured me. "Your grandfather was an exceptionally savvy investor. He lived modestly and saved aggressively. More importantly, he believed in rewarding character over achievement, substance over flash. He watched both you and your sister grow up, and he made his decision based on what he saw." The folder contained more than just account statements. There were letters Grandpa had written, explaining his reasoning. He detailed how he'd observed Victoria's increasing materialism, her dismissive treatment of people she considered beneath her, and her tendency to measure worth in dollars. He wrote about watching me choose teaching over higher-paying careers, seeing me volunteer at the community center on weekends, and noticing how I treated the grocery store clerk with the same respect I showed the bank president. But the most significant document in that folder was a property listing. The lakefront cabin at Cedar Point, the place our family had vacationed every summer when I was young, renting a small cottage 3 properties down from the beautiful craftsman-style home that sat right on the water. Dad used to walk past that house every morning during our vacations, coffee in hand, and just look at it. He'd tell me about how perfect it would be for retirement, how he'd fish from that dock every day, how he'd finally have time to restore the wooden boat that came with the property. It was his dream, spoken out loud year after year, yet always dismissed as impossible. "Your grandfather purchased this property 8 years ago," Howard had explained. "He bought it as an investment, but also as a gift waiting for the right moment. He wanted you to have the means to give your father something meaningful when the time came. He specified in his instructions that the property should be transferred to you, and that you should have full discretion about when and how to present it to your father." He smiled gently. "Henry said you'd know the right moment when it arrived." The cabin had been rented out since Grandpa's purchase, generating income that had helped fund the trust. Howard had managed everything, collecting rent, handling maintenance, and ensuring the property remained in excellent condition. 6 months before Dad's retirement announcement, the tenants had moved out, and I'd made the decision to stop renting it. Instead, I'd spent the last 18 months quietly preparing it for Dad. Every other weekend, I'd drive the 40 minutes to Cedar Point and work on the place. I'd painted walls in colors I knew he'd love. I'd restored the dock he'd admired, replacing rotten boards and reinforcing the structure. I'd furnished the place simply but comfortably, with a focus on function over style. The wooden boat Grandpa had mentioned was still there, and I'd paid to have it completely refurbished, ready for the retirement fishing trips Dad had always talked about. The expenses had been significant, but the trust was structured to cover them. What remained was still substantial, enough to ensure Dad never had to worry about property taxes or maintenance costs. Grandpa had thought of everything, creating a gift that would keep giving, providing not just a house but security and peace of mind. The only condition was that I couldn't tell anyone about the trust or the property purchase until I was ready. Grandpa had been specific about that. He wanted me to have control over the timing, to make the choice that felt right rather than being pressured by family expectations. Standing in the country club now, champagne soaking into the expensive carpet while Victoria continued her monologue about realistic expectations and knowing one's limitations, I felt something shift inside me. For years I'd accepted being the lesser sister, the one whose accomplishments were downplayed because they couldn't be measured in salary or status. I'd internalized the message that my choices made me somehow less than, that dedication to teaching children was admirable but ultimately small compared to Victoria's legal victories and impressive income. But holding the keys to Cedar Point in my purse, knowing what I'd quietly accomplished while Victoria assumed I was simply too poor to do better, I realized that Grandpa Henry had seen something my parents had missed. He'd recognized that real wealth wasn't about displaying success but about using resources to create meaning. "Emma, are you all right?" Dad had crossed to where I stood, concern etched on his face while other guests pretended to be absorbed in their own conversations. The album lay open on the gift table where Victoria had abandoned it, its pages of memories visible to anyone who cared to look. "I'm fine, Dad," I'd managed, my voice steadier than I felt. "Just clumsy with the glass." "Let me help you clean that up," he'd said, but a staff member was already approaching with a broom and dustpan. Dad had picked up the album instead, really looking at it for the first time. His weathered fingers traced over a photo of us at Cedar Point, him teaching me to cast a fishing line, both of us grinning at the camera Mom had been holding. "This is beautiful, sweetheart," he'd said quietly. "These memories, this is what matters." His eyes had grown damp as he turned pages, seeing his life reflected not in expensive gifts but in moments of connection. "You always understood that." Victoria had moved on to holding court with a group of her lawyer colleagues, her voice carrying across the room as she discussed some recent case victory. Mom stood with her, beaming with pride at her successful daughter, occasionally glancing over at Dad and me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Disappointment, maybe, that I'd embarrassed the family with my modest offering. Or perhaps just resignation that I'd never be the daughter who brought glory to the Richardson name. The party continued around us, but something had changed. Dad kept the album with him for the rest of the evening, showing it to his firefighter friends who actually looked through it carefully, pointing at photos and laughing at shared memories. These guys understood that the best gifts weren't always the most expensive. They'd spent careers in a profession where you measured success in lives saved and communities served, not in corner offices and client billings. They shook my hand and thanked me for honoring their captain properly, with something that came from the heart. I'd made it through the rest of the evening on autopilot, smiling when appropriate, accepting condolences from people who seemed to think Victoria's public mockery was just sisterly teasing taken a bit far. When the party finally ended and guests began trickling out to their luxury cars, I'd helped Dad carry his gifts to Mom's SUV. The fishing rod, the recliner, the cruise documents, all the things that represented what retirement was supposed to look like. The album he'd carried himself, tucking it carefully into the front seat where it wouldn't get damaged. Victoria had caught me at my car, her heels clicking on the parking lot pavement. "Emma, wait," she'd called, and I'd turned to face her, exhausted and ready to go home. "Look, I hope you're not upset about earlier," she'd said, though her tone suggested she didn't really care either way. "I was just being honest. You know I love you, but someone needs to be realistic with you about your limitations. You're a wonderful teacher, truly, but you can't give Dad the kind of retirement he deserves. That takes money, real money, not craft projects and sentiment." I'd looked at my sister, really looked at her, seeing perhaps for the first time how much she'd become a stranger to me. When had she transformed from the girl who used to build blanket forts with me into this person who measured human worth in dollar amounts? When had success become solely about accumulation rather than contribution? "Victoria," I'd said carefully, "have you ever considered that maybe you don't know everything about my situation?" She'd laughed, that bright dismissive sound I'd heard so many times. You're a public school teacher living in a rental apartment. I'm not judging, I'm just stating facts. There's no mystery about your financial situation. We all know exactly where you stand." The keys to Cedar Point had felt heavy in my purse, a secret weight that I wasn't quite ready to reveal. Not because I wanted to prove Victoria wrong, though that would certainly be satisfying, but because I needed to think about the right way to give Dad his gift. Grandpa Henry had trusted me with this responsibility, and I wanted to honor that trust by doing it properly. So I'd simply smiled at Victoria and said goodnight, driving home through Asheville's quiet streets while she'd headed back to her showcase house in Prestigious Meadows, completely confident in her understanding of the world and everyone's place in it. The morning after the retirement party, I woke early with a sense of purpose that had been building since Victoria's public humiliation. Grandpa Henry's voice echoed in my memory from one of our last conversations before he passed. "Emma," he'd said while we sat on his porch drinking sweet tea, "the best moments in life aren't the ones where you prove someone wrong. They're the ones where you prove yourself right." I'd spent the night thinking about those words, about what it meant to give a gift properly, and about the difference between revenge and justice. My apartment felt smaller that morning as I made coffee and pulled out the folder Howard Blake had given me 3 years ago. Inside were not just the property documents but letters Grandpa had written to me over the years, sealed and saved for after his passing. I'd read them all multiple times, but today I focused on one in particular. In it, he described watching Dad walk past the Cedar Point cabin during our family vacations, seeing the longing in his son's eyes, and feeling frustrated that Robert Richardson had spent his whole life putting others first and would likely retire without ever achieving his simple dream. "That's why I bought it," Grandpa had written in his careful handwriting. "Not for me, but for him. And I'm trusting you to know when the moment is right to make his dream real." I called Howard Blake's personal number, the one he'd given me for matters related to the trust. He answered on the second ring despite it being barely 7 in the morning. "Emma," he said warmly. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you. You heard about last night?" Word travels fast in Asheville, especially when it involves the Richardson family. Howard had been at the retirement party briefly, leaving early as he often did at social functions. "Your sister made quite an impression with her speech about realistic expectations." I felt anger rise again at the memory, but Howard continued before I could respond. "Your grandfather predicted something like this might happen. He knew Victoria's nature. That's partly why he structured things the way he did. He wanted you to have all the power in this situation, to make choices from a position of strength rather than defensiveness." "I need to give Dad the house," I said. "But I want to do it right. Not as a response to Victoria, but as the gift it was always meant to be." Howard was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear him thinking through the logistics. "The property is fully in your name, transferred legally 18 months ago. You have complete authority to gift it to your father however you choose. However, I'd recommend we make it a proper legal transfer with all documentation in order. Your father will need to understand the tax implications, the trust funds set aside for maintenance, and the full scope of what he's receiving." We spent an hour on the phone working through details. The house would be transferred to Dad with a perpetual trust covering property taxes and basic maintenance, ensuring he'd never have to worry about losing it due to financial hardship. The remaining balance in Grandpa Henry's trust would stay in my name but be designated for Dad's needs as they arose. Howard would prepare all the paperwork, and we'd schedule a proper meeting at his office where everything could be explained clearly and legally. "What about Victoria and your mother?" Howard asked carefully. "They'll need to know eventually." "Let's tell Dad first," I said. "This gift is about him, not about proving anything to anyone else." "But Howard," I paused, uncertain how to phrase my concern. "Do you think Grandpa would approve of how I'm handling this?" "Emma," Howard's voice was gentle but firm. "Henry Richardson was one of the wisest men I ever knew. He spent 3 years planning this gift, thinking through every contingency, and he chose you as the executor of his true legacy. Not because you were poor or needed help, but because you understood what actually mattered. He'd be proud of your restraint at that party, and he'd be proud that you're prioritizing your father's feelings over your sister's comeuppance." We set the meeting for 3 days later, giving Howard time to prepare documents and me time to figure out how to tell Dad he needed to come to a lawyer's office without raising too many questions. Those 3 days felt eternal. I went through the motions at Riverside Elementary, teaching my second graders about fractions and reading comprehension while my mind wandered to Cedar Point and the look I imagined would cross Dad's face when he understood what was happening. My teaching assistant, Jennifer, noticed my distraction during lunch on Tuesday. "Everything okay, Emma? You seem somewhere else today." "Just family stuff," I'd said, which was true enough. She'd nodded sympathetically. "I heard about your dad's retirement party. My cousin was there. She said your sister gave you a hard time about your gift." The story had spread, as stories do in a city like Asheville where everyone seemed connected by no more than 2 degrees of separation. I'd heard whispers in the teacher's lounge, seen pitying looks from colleagues who knew my family dynamics. Part of me wanted to shout the truth, to defend myself against the narrative that I was the struggling sister who couldn't afford a proper gift. But Grandpa's voice kept me grounded. Let your actions speak, Emma. Words are cheap. Integrity is priceless. So I kept quiet, continued my work, and waited for Friday's meeting at Howard Blake's office. Wednesday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to my classroom. I was erasing the whiteboard after dismissal when I heard heels clicking in the hallway. Victoria appeared in my doorway, looking out of place among the colorful alphabet posters and student artwork. She was dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, carrying her designer briefcase like a shield. Emma, we need to talk, she said without preamble. I set down the eraser and turned to face her, suddenly aware of how different our worlds had become. She surveyed my classroom with barely concealed condescension, taking in the worn carpet and second-hand furniture that characterized public school funding. This is where you spend your days, she murmured, almost to herself. Teaching other people's children for poverty wages. It's where I make a difference, I replied evenly. Every child who leaves this classroom reading above grade level, every kid who discovers they love learning, that matters. Victoria waved her hand dismissively. I'm not here to debate your career choices. I came because Mom is worried about you. After the party, after your little gift, she thinks maybe you're struggling financially more than we realized. We want to help. The condescension in her voice was wrapped in concern, making it somehow worse than outright mockery. I don't need help, Victoria. I'm doing fine. She pulled out her checkbook, actually pulled out a physical checkbook like she was in some movie about rich people solving problems with money. I'm going to write you a check for $5,000. Use it to get yourself some decent clothes, maybe take a small vacation, treat yourself to something nice for once. You don't have to live like this, Emma. You have family who can support you. The gesture was so perfectly Victoria, so absolutely certain that money was the solution to every problem, that I almost laughed. Instead, I simply said, I don't want your money. Put the checkbook away. Her expression shifted from benevolent concern to irritation. Why do you have to be so stubborn? This is exactly your problem. You're so busy being proud that you can't accept help when it's offered. Do you know how embarrassing it was having my colleagues at the party see my sister give our father a scrapbook? Do you understand how that reflects on me? And there it was, the real issue. Not concern for my well-being but anxiety about her image, about how my perceived poverty might tarnish her shine. Victoria, I said carefully, have you ever considered that maybe I'm not struggling? That maybe I'm exactly where I want to be, doing exactly what I want to do? She laughed, that same bright cutting sound from the party. Emma, you're a teacher living in a rental apartment driving a car that's older than some of your students. You're struggling whether you admit it or not. The fact that you've convinced yourself otherwise is actually kind of sad. She tucked the checkbook back into her briefcase. The offer stands. When you're ready to be realistic about your situation, we're here to help. She left without waiting for a response, her heels clicking back down the hallway past construction paper butterflies and handprint art projects, leaving me standing in my classroom feeling a complex mixture of anger and pity. That evening, I drove out to Cedar Point alone. The cabin looked beautiful in the fading light, its craftsman details highlighted by the setting sun reflecting off the lake. I walked through the rooms I'd carefully prepared, imagining Dad here, finally living the dream he'd talked about for decades. The main bedroom had windows overlooking the water, perfect for morning coffee while watching the sunrise. The workshop in the converted garage was equipped with tools I'd slowly accumulated, knowing Dad's love of woodworking. The dock stretched into clear water, and the restored boat rocked gently against its moorings, ready for fishing expeditions that would finally have all the time in the world. I sat on the porch swing Grandpa had installed years ago and thought about family, about love expressed through actions rather than words, about the difference between giving gifts that impressed others versus gifts that touched hearts. Victoria would never understand this place. She'd see the dollar value, calculate the investment potential, maybe suggest renovations that would increase resale value. She'd miss entirely what made it precious, the memories embedded in every board, the dreams woven into every sunset view, the peace that came from having a place that was truly home. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. Victoria told me about her visit to your school. Honey, please let us help you. There's no shame in accepting support from family. I stared at the message, at the fundamental misunderstanding it represented. They saw my life as something requiring rescue, my choices as mistakes needing correction. The idea that I might be content, that I might have resources they didn't know about, that I might have made deliberate choices leading to genuine fulfillment, none of that occurred to them. I typed back a simple response. I'm fine, Mom. Really? See you soon. Friday arrived with clear skies and a nervousness I hadn't anticipated. I'd asked Dad to meet me at Howard Blake's office at 10, telling him only that it related to some final details from Grandpa Henry's estate. He'd agreed readily, curious but not suspicious. I arrived early, finding Howard already prepared with documents arranged neatly on his conference table. Emma, he greeted me, are you ready for this? I nodded, though my stomach was churning with anticipation. Your father is going to be overwhelmed. Make sure he sits down before we show him everything. Dad arrived exactly on time, as he always did, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. His retirement had only been official for a week, but already he looked different, more relaxed without the weight of command responsibility on his shoulders. He hugged me in the lobby, smelling of Old Spice and coffee, and looked around the historic building with interest. Haven't been here since Henry's will reading, he said. Howard keeping busy? We went upstairs to the conference room where Howard waited. The older attorney shook Dad's hand warmly, exchanging pleasantries about retirement and asking about his plans. Dad had launched into his standard response, something about finally having time to fish and maybe do some traveling, when Howard gently interrupted. Robert, why don't you have a seat? Emma has asked me here today because there's something important she needs to share with you, something that involves your father's estate. Dad's expression shifted to concern as he sat down across from me. Is everything all right? Did Henry have debts we didn't know about? Nothing like that, I assured him quickly. Dad, do you remember how Grandpa used to tell stories about his investment philosophy? How he believed in living simply and planning for the future? Sure, Dad said slowly. He was always careful with money. Drove that old truck forever, clipped coupons even though he could afford not to. Your mother used to get frustrated with him about it. Howard slid a folder across the table. What you may not have known is just how successful Henry's investment strategy was. Over 40 years, he built substantial wealth through careful saving and smart investing. The public will reading distributed token amounts to family members, but Henry had a separate plan for his primary assets. Dad opened the folder, his eyes scanning the first page. His brow furrowed in confusion. I don't understand. This says Emma is the beneficiary of a trust worth over $2 million. Why am I just hearing about this now? Because Grandpa asked me to keep it private until the right time, I explained. He didn't want the family knowing about it. He was specific about that. He left me this inheritance with instructions on how to use it, and more importantly, who to use it for. Dad looked from me to Howard and back again. Emma, this is life-changing money. You could pay off any debts, buy a house, travel. Why are you showing this to me? Because I already used some of it, I said, my voice catching slightly. I used it to buy something I knew you'd love more than anything else I could give you. Howard pulled out another set of documents, and I watched Dad's face as he began reading. His expression moved from confusion to disbelief to something approaching shock. These are property documents, he said quietly. For the cabin at Cedar Point. The one we used to walk past every summer. The one I always said would be perfect for retirement. He looked up at me, his eyes glistening. Emma, what is this? I bought it 18 months ago, I told him, the words tumbling out now. Grandpa purchased it 8 years back as an investment, and when he passed, it became part of my inheritance. I've been fixing it up every weekend, getting it ready for you. The dock is restored, the boat is refurbished, everything inside is set up exactly how I thought you'd want it. It's yours, Dad. Your retirement dream. Free and clear. The silence in the room was profound. Dad stared at the documents, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he turned pages showing photos of the property, legal descriptions, and the deed transfer papers that needed only his signature. But this must have cost, he started, then stopped, overwhelmed. Honey, this is too much. I can't accept something like this. Yes, you can, I said firmly. Grandpa Henry wanted this. He watched you admire that house for years. He saw how much you sacrificed for our family, working double shifts to pay for Victoria's law school, picking up extra hours so Mom could have the kitchen remodeled she wanted, always putting everyone else first. He wanted you to have something that was just for you, something that represented the life you'd earned. Howard cleared his throat gently. Robert, there's more. Emma has also established a trust to cover all property taxes and maintenance costs in perpetuity. You'll never have to worry about losing the cabin due to financial strain. It's protected, and it's yours for as long as you want it. Dad pushed back from the table, standing abruptly and walking to the window overlooking downtown Asheville. His shoulders shook, and I realized he was crying, this man who'd run into burning buildings without hesitation, who'd commanded emergency scenes with calm authority, reduced to tears by kindness. I went to him, putting my hand on his arm. Dad, are you okay? He turned and pulled me into a fierce hug, the kind he used to give when I was little and had scraped my knee or lost a soccer game. Emma, he said into my hair, I don't know what to say. All these years I thought you were struggling, thought maybe I'd failed you somehow by not being able to help more financially. And here you've been quietly taking care of me. You didn't fail me, I said, my own tears flowing now. You taught me what actually matters. You showed me that being rich isn't about money, it's about integrity and service and love. Grandpa saw that in you, and he wanted to make sure you finally got something back for all you've given. We stood there for a long moment while Howard tactfully busied himself with papers. Finally Dad pulled back, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Does your mother know about this? Not yet, I admitted. I wanted to tell you first. This is your gift, and I wanted you to have it without any family drama attached. He nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken reference to Victoria and the retirement party. That scrapbook, he said suddenly. The one Victoria made fun of. Emma, I want you to know that gift meant more to me than any cruise or fishing rod. Those memories you collected, the time you put into it, that was priceless. The album is at the cabin, I told him. I brought it out there last weekend and put it on the coffee table. I thought it belonged in your new home. A smile broke through his tears. Can we go see it? Right now? I want to see what you've done with the place. Howard handed Dad the keys, a simple brass set on a ring shaped like a fish. These are yours, Robert. Emma had me make multiple copies. She's thought of everything. The drive to Cedar Point took 40 minutes, but it felt both endless and too short. Dad kept looking at the keys in his hand like he expected them to disappear. We talked during the drive, really talked in a way we hadn't in years. He told me about the summers we'd spent at Cedar Point, how those weeks had been the highlight of his year, a chance to disconnect from the stress of firefighting and just be present with his family. He admitted that he'd sometimes drive out to the lake on his days off, just to sit in the parking area and look at the cabin, imagining what it would be like to wake up there every morning. I told him about discovering Grandpa's inheritance, about the shock of learning I had resources I'd never expected, and about the immediate certainty I'd felt that this money wasn't really mine, it was a tool to accomplish something meaningful. I described the weekends I'd spent at the cabin, scrubbing and painting and fixing, how therapeutic the work had been, how connected I'd felt to Grandpa with every board I'd nailed and every wall I'd repaired. We didn't talk about Victoria or the retirement party. That drama felt small and distant compared to this moment of pure connection between father and daughter. When we turned onto the long driveway leading to the cabin, Dad's breath caught. The property looked perfect in the late morning sun, the lake sparkling beyond the house, the trees providing shade without blocking the view. I'd hung a simple wooden sign at the entrance that read Richardson's Landing, carved by a local artisan who specialized in rustic work. Dad noticed it immediately. "You even named it," he whispered. "Of course," I said. "Every dream home needs a name." We parked and Dad got out slowly, taking in every detail. The porch where he'd imagined drinking his morning coffee. The workshop where he could finally build the furniture he'd sketched designs for over the years. The dock where his restored boat waited. He walked around the property like a man in a dream, touching the railings I'd refinished, examining the new shingles I'd had installed, running his hand along the boat's smooth hull. Inside, the cabin was warm and welcoming, furnished simply but comfortably. I'd hung photos of our family throughout the rooms, creating a sense of history and belonging. The scrapbook sat on the coffee table exactly as I'd told him, but now its presence had different meaning. It wasn't a poor substitute for a real gift. It was part of a larger whole, memories of the past paired with the reality of the present and the promise of the future. Dad sat heavily on the couch, still overwhelmed. "The main bedroom has a king-size bed and a view of the sunrise," I told him. "The kitchen is fully equipped. There's a pantry stocked with basics to get you started. The workshop has tools and a workbench. I've set up accounts with local services for anything you might need." He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something beyond gratitude, beyond love, something approaching awe. "How did you do all this without me knowing? You were working, raising your family, dealing with retirement planning. I just made sure to come out here when you were busy. Jennifer from school helped sometimes, and Howard coordinated the contractor work. It was like planning a surprise party, except the surprise was a whole house." Dad stood and walked through each room methodically, opening closets and cabinets, testing faucets and light switches, absorbing the reality that this was truly his. In the workshop, he found the woodworking tools I'd selected, each one chosen based on years of watching what he used and what he wished he had. There was even a blueprint table where he could spread out his furniture designs. He traced his fingers over the tools with reverence. "Emma, this must have cost a fortune." "The trust covered it," I assured him. "Grandpa planned for all of this. He wanted you to have not just a house but a home where you could pursue everything you'd put off during your working years." We spent the rest of the day at Cedar Point, and I watched my father transform before my eyes. The weight he'd carried for 35 years, the constant worry about providing for his family and ensuring everyone else's needs were met before his own, seemed to lift with each moment he spent in his dream home. We took the boat out on the lake, and though neither of us caught anything worth mentioning, Dad laughed more freely than I'd heard in years. He talked about his plans for the place, the garden he'd plant in spring, the deck furniture he'd build himself, the mornings he'd spend watching the water change colors with the sunrise. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the lake, we sat on the dock with our feet dangling over the water, and Dad finally asked the question I'd been expecting. "What are you going to tell your mother and Victoria?" "The truth," I said simply. "That Grandpa left me an inheritance, that I used it to buy you this house, and that it's done and legally finalized. There's nothing to negotiate or discuss." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Victoria is going to be difficult about this." "She already thinks I'm difficult, Dad. This doesn't change anything except now she'll have to acknowledge she was wrong about my financial situation. Maybe that's not the worst thing." Dad squeezed my shoulder. "Your grandfather used to say that Victoria measured success by addition while you measured it by multiplication. I never understood what he meant until right now. She adds things to her life, possessions and titles and money, thinking that's what makes her valuable. But you multiply the good things, taking what you have and using it to create more happiness for others. That's real wealth, Emma. Real success." We sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the calm water. I thought about Grandpa Henry sitting in this exact spot years ago, planning this moment, trusting me to carry out his vision. He'd understood something fundamental about love and legacy, that the best gifts aren't the ones that impress others but the ones that change lives quietly and permanently. The reckoning with Mom and Victoria came sooner than expected. That evening, as Dad and I were driving back from Cedar Point, Mom called his phone. Where have you been all day? We've been trying to reach you. I had something important to show Emma, Dad said, his voice carrying a contentment that must have been audible even through the phone. We'll be home soon. We need to talk. Mom's tone suggested this wasn't a request. Victoria is here. We're at the house waiting for you. Dad glanced at me and I nodded. Might as well get it over with. We're on our way, he told Mom, and ended the call. My parents' house in the suburbs looked the same as always, well-maintained and unremarkable, the kind of place that suggested middle-class comfort without ostentation. Victoria's Mercedes sat in the driveway like an accusation. Inside, Mom and Victoria waited in the living room, both wearing expressions of concern that barely masked irritation. There you are, Mom said as we entered. Robert, we've been worried sick. You weren't answering your phone, nobody knew where you were. I was with Emma, Dad said calmly. And I turned my phone off because I didn't want to be disturbed. Victoria stood, her lawyer instincts clearly activated. Dad, we need to talk about Emma's financial situation. After the retirement party, after seeing how she's struggling, we've decided as a family that we need to stage an intervention. An intervention? I repeated, almost laughing at the absurdity. Victoria, I don't need an intervention. You clearly do, she insisted. Emma, there's no shame in admitting you're in over your head financially. We're prepared to help you restructure your debts, maybe find you a better paying position, get you back on stable ground. Girls, Dad interrupted, but Victoria continued as if he hadn't spoken. We've even talked to some contacts about teaching positions at private schools that pay significantly better. You could double your salary, maybe get out of that depressing apartment, start living a life that doesn't embarrass the family. That's enough, Dad said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades commanding emergency scenes. Victoria, sit down and be quiet. The shock on her face would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious. Dad never raised his voice to his golden child, never contradicted her or challenged her assumptions. But something had shifted in him during our day at Cedar Point, some fundamental recalibration of priorities and perspectives. Emma doesn't need your help, Dad continued. In fact, Emma has been helping me in ways you can't begin to understand. He pulled out his phone and showed them photos he'd taken at the cabin. This is Cedar Point, the property I've dreamed about for 30 years. As of this morning, it's mine. Emma bought it for me 18 months ago using an inheritance from your grandfather that none of you knew about. She's spent every weekend since then preparing it for my retirement. The room went silent. Mom stared at the photos, her mouth slightly open. Victoria's face cycled through disbelief, confusion, and finally something that looked like anger. That's impossible, Victoria said flatly. That property is worth over $1 million. Emma can't afford something like that. Grandpa Henry left me a trust worth $2.4 million, I said, keeping my voice level. He purchased the Cedar Point cabin 8 years ago as an investment and left it to me with specific instructions to give it to Dad when the time was right. Everything is legal and documented. Howard Blake handled all the paperwork. Victoria's face flushed red. That can't be legal. There must be grounds to contest. Henry's will was clear. We all got our inheritance. This is fraud or undue influence or something. Actually, Howard assured me it's completely legal and uncontestable, I replied. Grandpa had every right to structure his estate however he wanted. He chose to give his primary assets to me because he trusted me to use them wisely. Mom found her voice finally. Emma, why didn't you tell us about this inheritance? Because Grandpa asked me not to, I said simply. He wanted me to have the freedom to make my own choices without family pressure or expectations. He knew that if Victoria found out about the money, she'd have opinions about how I should use it. He was protecting me and protecting his gift to Dad. This is unbelievable, Victoria said, but the anger in her voice was tinged with something else now, perhaps the dawning realization that she'd misjudged everything. You've been sitting on millions while letting us all think you were poor. Do you know how that makes us look? And there it was, the core of Victoria's concern. Not happiness for Dad, not recognition of Grandpa's generosity, but worry about appearances and image. That's what you're focused on? I asked. How this makes you look? Your father just received his dream home and your concern is your reputation? Dad put his hand on my arm, a gentle reminder to stay calm. Linda, Victoria, he said to his wife and daughter, I understand this is surprising news. But I need you both to hear something clearly. Emma has given me the greatest gift I've ever received. Not because it's expensive, though it is, but because it represents years of thoughtful planning and genuine love. She honored her grandfather's wishes and my dreams without seeking recognition or praise. That's character. That's integrity. Mom's expression softened as she looked at the photos again, really seeing them this time. The cabin is beautiful, she said quietly. Robert, you must be thrilled. I am, Dad said. More than I can express. And I'm proud of Emma for having the wisdom to use her resources this way. Victoria remained standing, clearly struggling with emotions she wasn't accustomed to processing. Fine, she said finally. Congratulations on your windfall, Emma. I hope you're satisfied with your dramatic reveal. She grabbed her purse and headed for the door, pausing only to add, though I still think Grandpa Henry showed incredibly poor judgment in his estate planning. The door closed behind her with more force than necessary. In the weeks that followed, Dad moved into Cedar Point permanently, and the cabin became exactly what Grandpa Henry had envisioned, a sanctuary where a man who'd spent his career serving others could finally rest and pursue his own happiness. I visited most weekends, and we'd fish off the dock or work on woodworking projects in the shop, comfortable in the silence that came from deep understanding. Mom eventually apologized for not recognizing my situation more clearly, admitting she'd let Victoria's narrative shape her perception. Victoria sent a brief text weeks later acknowledging that perhaps she'd been hasty in her judgments, though she never quite managed a full apology. The story spread through Asheville eventually, as stories do, but the narrative had changed. Instead of the struggling teacher who couldn't afford a proper gift, I became the devoted daughter who'd secretly planned for years to give her father his dreams. Some people asked why I hadn't just told everyone from the start, but the answer was simple. The gift was never about proving anything to anyone. It was about honoring Grandpa Henry's trust and Dad's sacrifice, about understanding that real wealth isn't measured in what you display but in what you do when nobody's watching. 6 months after the retirement party, I stood on the dock at Cedar Point watching Dad teach a group of neighborhood kids to fish, passing on his knowledge and patience to a new generation. He'd found his purpose in retirement, not in idle luxury but in continued service, just expressed differently now. Grandpa Henry had known this would happen, had understood that giving Dad security wouldn't make him selfish but would free him to be even more generous with his time and wisdom. That evening, as the kids headed home with their modest catches and oversized grins, Dad and I sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky. Thank you, he said simply. For all of this. Thank you for trusting Grandpa's vision, I replied. Thank you for showing me what it means to live with purpose instead of just accumulating things. We sat together as darkness fell softly over the lake, two people who understood that the best legacies aren't built with grand gestures but with quiet acts of love that ripple forward through time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.